Alrighty. Okay. So thank you, Mabalu, for the introduction. My name is Leah McDonald, and I'm the Child and Youth Settlement Counselor at CCVT. I'm joined by my colleague, Nadia Umadat, who is the Youth Mental Health Counselor at CCVT.
Good morning.
So we will be talking to you about conceptualizing trauma and working with children and youth survivors during COVID-19 and these unprecedented times. So these are our experiences working with the service users at CCVT. So before we even begin and get into anything, we wanted to do a poll just to get a feel of who's joining us today. So I'm just going to share that, and I'm going to give about 30 seconds. There's just 3 questions. Okay, and then I'll share the results. So there we go. Okay, a few more seconds. I see there's about 10 people still. Okay. So I'm just going to end the poll and share it with everyone. So we just wanted to ask this to see, yeah, like I said, where everyone's coming from and your field of work. So it looks like the majority of people are in the settlement sector, some counselors, a little bit of educators, child and youth practitioners, family support, which is great. The second question, where are you joining us from? So majority coming from Toronto, and inside Canada, outside of Toronto, and some international folk as well, which is great. And experiences. So what has your experience been with adapting services to an online COVID-19 child and youth friendly model? Looks like challenging, but overall positive, and challenging and struggling, and then business as usual. So yeah, that seems to be our experience as well. Is, of course, it was a bit of a challenge. There needed to be adaptations, but overall, we're doing well. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming out today. And because we do have a diverse people from different fields attending the session, we do ask if you have, I'm just going to stop sharing. If you have certain experiences that are maybe a bit different than ours because maybe you're out west in Canada or international, how COVID-19 has affected your programming, please share it with us. We do have a colleague of ours who will be navigating the chat. So if you have a relevant question, she'll let us know, and then we can have a discussion. If not, there's also time for Q&A at the end. Yeah, so we're open to having a dialogue today. This presentation is our experiences, like I had said earlier, and the experiences of the service users. And this is from a Toronto perspective. So what we hope to share with you today in the learning objectives is to describe ways that anti-oppressive approaches can be used to meaningfully engage refugee children and youth during COVID-19. We want to encourage an ongoing critical self-reflection in your own work with refugee children and youth. And we're also going to talk about the impacts that COVID-19 has had directly on supporting refugee children and youth. I also want to state here that some of the content can be difficult to hear or engage in. So at any point, if you do need a break, please feel free to step out, get yourself a glass of water, and join in when you can. Okay, so let's get started. For those who are not familiar with CCVT's mandate, we have it posted here. And CCVT's, we aid survivors in overcoming the lasting effects of torture, war, genocide, and crimes against humanity. We do this by having a community-based approach in the hopes of a successful integration into Canadian society. I also want to state that we have 5 offices across the GTA. So these are the programs and services available at CCVT: settlement and trauma counseling with language-specific counselors, support groups, English language and computer skills courses, the Children and Youth Program, which we're going to be highlighting today, the Mental Health Program, and the Community Engagement Program. And just to note that this is available across all demographics. So just to go into the child and youth specific programs, we have our summer recreation program, which we call Summer Quest, and that's actually happening right now. Before COVID-19, we were able to just explore the city, go to the Royal Ontario Museum, canoeing to Toronto Island, rock climbing. It was really just an opportunity for the children and youth to get out and explore and do some fun things in the summer. So now it's had a virtual spin on it. So everything is online. And we've done things like bingo, word challenges, movie night, Jeopardy, and the list goes on. We had homework club in office and during the school year. So what that looks like come September, we haven't really planned it too far in advance, but there will definitely be some type of support online. Youth Network, which, as I said at the bottom there, it has become virtual, and Youth Network includes information and settlement type of programming. So having housing topics, maybe a legal clinic coming in and talking about rights for children and youth, and or educational programs, etc. And then we have the Youth Mentorship Program, and this program has gone virtual, and the Leadership Program. So I'd like to just talk about now the community-based approach that I had addressed, and it's part of our mandate. And so there's an internal and an external network. In our internal network, we have experienced physicians, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, and other specialists, such as lawyers and social service workers, who provide treatment, documentation, and legal support. So I would say that the main referral for the children and youth to our internal network would be not only to the child and youth counselor, but for psychiatric assessments with our psychiatrists and psychotherapists. And this assessment and report is used for their refugee claim in their hearing, and it acts as evidence. Now, the effects that COVID-19 has had on our internal network is that all services have become virtual. So our internal staff of psychiatrists and psychotherapists completing their assessments, it's all online and it's all virtual, and it's using the Ontario Telemedicine Network, OTN, or Zoom. And this in itself poses challenges. This is to assume that our service users have access to laptops or phones, which not all do. And it also poses challenges, for example, what we have starred here, that for medical appointments and a scar analysis, this can be extremely challenging because it's just not the same as an in-person consultation and not as accurate. Okay, so looking at our external network, I just have a list here of some of the connections to local. So when I talk about this, it is in the Toronto area, to community resources. So these include health, social, educational, housing, and legal. And I just want to point out a few from each. Crossroads Refugee Clinic, for example, which is located at the Women's College Hospital. This is a huge referral for us. It's a refugee-specific clinic, and they have primary care, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, social workers, and a trauma therapy program, which is popular. We have community health clinics, of course. We have the social, so the Royal Ontario Museum we have partnership with, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. So these were all partnerships where we could plan summer quests to go to, or you know, we could have access actually for the whole year. And so this has kind of been halted right now. Actually, I do think that the ROM and AGO have opened up, but yeah, I think that this is just, it's a gradual open, and I'm not 100% sure about how our access to it. So educational programs listed there, housing help centers, housing organizations, and then legal referral to legal aid, the Refugee Legal Clinic, and other community legal clinics. So the effects that COVID-19 has had on our external network is quite great. For example, all of the appointments at the community health centers or refugee clinic, these have all become telehealth appointments. So it's virtual. Because of this, we are seeing longer wait times, and there is a breakdown in communication. So some youth not knowing if they can reach out, if things are open. And then we're also seeing community programs being halted. So other refugee serving or youth serving, children and youth serving programs have completely stopped, or they've gone virtual. And once again, access to technology is an issue, or just the parameters of the program is just, it's not made to have 50 people check in over Zoom. So there has been some gaps in our social programs and community programs. Also, educational programs that have gone online. This has been difficult for some of the youth. Once again, access to technology. I will state here that one of the good things that we've seen at CCVT is that we were running a computer program, or we still are actually, and it started just as COVID-19 had started, and it is an affordable computer program. So a lot of the youth, when their educational programs went virtual, they were able to access affordable laptops, and actually a lot of the youth were able to register in this program. Okay. So who is a refugee? This definition CCVT uses, and it's from the 1951 Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees. So it is a person who is persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So I do want to highlight that Canada is actually one of the few countries where sexual orientation is included in the inclusion criteria. So this is an overview of CCVT's programs and who it is that we serve. So now I just want to get a little bit deeper into the experiences of our service users and how we directly support them. So starting with what is torture and what do we mean by torture? So the definition that CCVT uses is based on the Convention Against Torture. And this act looks specifically at acts perpetrated by the government, police, or military. And it wasn't until a few years ago that CCVT started to use, in combination, the World Health Organization definition, which includes organized violence and groups like paramilitary and opposition parties. So this list that you see in front of you is some of the experiences of the children and youth that we serve. Okay, so this may be repeat information for those coming from the settlement sector, but really quickly, just to go through the refugee system in Canada and the effects that COVID-19 has had on the system. There's a few slides where we'll go through this. So there's resettlement from outside Canada, and this looks like government or private sponsorship. and that sponsorship lasts about a year. Then there's a refugee claim from inside Canada, and this goes through the Immigration and Refugee Board. Claims are made at borders, airports, or CBSA offices. Now with this and the effects that COVID-19 has, I would say that the majority of the challenge was that there was limited and contradictory information about international travel. Also just misinformation about Canada's acceptance of asylum seekers during COVID-19. So just not knowing if you were first able to leave your country and if the borders were restricted. And even if you were to leave, was Canada accepting asylum seekers at that time? Okay, so the process for refugee claimants, just to quickly go through as well. So number 1, makes an asylum claim and surrenders travel documents. 2, attends preliminary interviews, secures lawyer who prepares basis of claim and submits documents. Gather documents from both country of origin and Canada to support identity, corroborate story, and community engagement. So this piece I just want to talk about. So this has become extremely difficult for not only children and youth, but all refugee claimants, because essentially there's been a worldwide shutdown. So getting, they're asked to get their university degrees, their certificates, and the schools are closed, or asked to get a government ID of whatever kind, and these agencies are closed. So collecting evidence for their hearing has become extremely difficult. Also, the waiting period is not standardized, though trends vary between 9 months to 3 years. I would say to this point, this was kind of before COVID, I would say to that point, that the hearings that were scheduled have been postponed. So we don't know when they're going to actually happen now. And they have not been rescheduled yet. And there has been no new hearings scheduled. However, when talking to my colleagues, some clients, it seems like, are hearing, but this has not become the pattern yet. This is not the everyday, we're not hearing that our clients are getting dates or scheduled hearings yet. However, if you have experience, please let us know in the chat. We're open to a discussion here, and I think, maybe it's internationally or across Canada, maybe you're having different experiences, so please share that with us. And then I want to point out, actually back to number 5, that we don't know now how long it's going to take for a refugee claimant who came maybe in March, how long it's going to take now. If it was originally taking 2 years to 3 years, is it now going to take 3 to 4 years of them waiting? So I think we're all interested to find out how this is going to go. So number 6, during the hearing, members are evaluating case for credibility, availability of state protection, and arising persecution. Additional criteria of seeking refuge elsewhere is applied to certain cases. So what this means is they may question, if you came from, if you went through a bordering country, why didn't you seek refuge there? If you came through the United States, why didn't you seek refugee status in the United States? And vice versa. So this can be challenged and can be difficult. So another thing I want to point out, so the effects of COVID-19 is that the IRB had no remote processes in place. So this means that once COVID-19 hit, everything had stopped. So the processing of refugee claims, and as discussed, no new hearings, and hearings that were scheduled were postponed. So everything kind of just halted. And this was very impactful to our service users because they were unable to secure their refugee ID. And with that ID, we know comes access to many things, and so that access was taken away. I know that the number was available, but that was still a long waiting period for our service users. So yeah, the effects that COVID-19 has played on this process alone is very extreme. I do want to mention that I would say most of the youth that are in downtown CCVT are unaccompanied to Canada, and they would have to do this whole process alone. Of course, if they get legal aid, they would have a lawyer help with the process and their basis of claim and gathering documents and advocating. And if they were working, they would have to pay for a lawyer, so thousands of dollars, and go through this process. Minors, so 17 and under, would do this with the help of a designated representative. So we just wanted to show some of the impacts on of torture and war on individuals, so some psychological and physical impacts. So this list, it's different for every service user, you know, and it's rarely that we see one. They're intersecting, and you may see 5 of these, 2 of these, but we just wanted to just put a list up of some of the most common ones. Okay, so we're going to get into the impacts of trauma on learning. So I'm going to talk about this slide, and then we're going to look at how COVID-19 has impacted learning for our service users. So there's been problems with memory, difficulty retaining information, learning new things, remembering facts or lists, difficulty retaining information gathered from verbal sources. So as, you know, if we go to a doctor and they say, okay, we'll see you next Thursday, for us, you know, we make note in our head, or we go home and we write it down on the calendar. This is a little bit more difficult for some of the service users. Difficulty sustaining focused attention, easily distracted, feeling nervous, anxious, panic attacks, always on alert. Fatigue, learning interrupted from an early age due to war or conflict. Lack of confidence, lack of motivation, lack of concentration, missing classes due to medical appointments and appointments with lawyers, doctors, settlement agencies. I'm sure if you work in the settlement field or counseling, you'll see this a lot. You know, you have youth that are going from appointment to appointment, coming to your programs. They're also told that if they volunteer, it looks really good for their case. So they're volunteering, they're going to school, to their lawyers, doctors, counselors. So they're always on the move, I guess you could say. And of course, this is going to have an impact on their learning and trying to focus on one thing. One thing that I do suggest to a lot of the newer youth that come into CCVT is having a notebook. So, you know, it helps with them trying to just write everything down, appointments, schoolwork, and just having that with them at all times, because there is a lot going on. And there's, you know, past trauma, but also the settlement process here, it's not easy. And going through a refugee claim is there's a lot going on. So that can kind of help just write everything down for them. Okay, so how has this impacted, or how has COVID-19 impacted that? How has it impacted learning? So it's everything from the last slide, but now we're seeing things heightened. So now we're seeing a broken routine. People are not able to see their friends and are feeling more isolated. So where you might have had a child or youth before who were really building up their self-esteem, their confidence, they were riding the TTC, and they were able to, you know, feel comfortable in a classroom. Now this is broken. So the routine has halted, and now they are staying, whether they're in a shelter or an apartment, wherever they may be, they're feeling isolated again. So this, not that it like stops the settlement process, but it does hinder maybe their progress. You know, they take a step back and now it feels like they take a step forward and now it feels like they're taking a step back. There's also higher levels of domestic and sexual violence in the home. So people are sheltering in place, and this we're seeing higher levels of domestic and sexual violence, hard to stay engaged in online learning, and that goes hand in hand with the shelter-in-place distractions. So, you know, maybe you are in a shelter with 100 other people in a room. It is a little bit difficult to kind of access your educational program and concentrate. Also, maybe it's a large family. Maybe you're here with 5 of your siblings, and it's hard to find a quiet room. We all know from working at home, it's difficult to find a quiet room. So it definitely impacts the focus and concentration. Also, access to technology, which is a huge one. If you don't have access to a laptop, I mean, we try to you know, use our phones to access stuff, and it can be very difficult, let alone trying to complete an educational program over your phone. Language. So the language barrier, this is an important one, especially working with parents or guardians of children and youth. So when school went virtual, it was extremely difficult for parents or guardians whose English is a second language to talk to the teachers, or to advocate for the children, or just to even know what is going on with the school system. And access to interpreters is extremely rare, I guess you could say. And it's difficult for us. I mean, our experiences at CCVT and advocating for these children, as rarely does the social worker or the guidance counselor have access to an interpreter. And if they do, you know, the wait time for that is long, and they don't mention it unless we ask. So there's a lot of advocacy in that piece. Computer literacy. So, you know, if you do have children, maybe the parents or guardians don't know how to even use the laptop or to access the work online. And academic support, just not having the support system in place that was pre-COVID. So maybe tutors, or just being able to go into the school, staying late for a homework club. So that all just disappeared as well. And then I talked about shelter in place. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it off to Nadia.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Excuse me. So I'm going to be taking over for the next few slides, and we're just going to be touching on a few different topics. So as Leah just previously spoke about trauma, we wanted to add a few more notes on trauma when working with this particularly vulnerable population. Trauma exerts a fundamentally disorganizing effect on families, and that can be in a number of different ways. So we can see that as parents being traumatized and not being able to perform caregiver duties, and children stepping up to fill the gaps in those tasks. We can see it with children and youth acting out, with behavioral outbursts, making it very difficult for parents to set boundaries and insert those tasks. And we can also see it in the form of generational trauma. So caregivers, guardians being traumatized long before they become parents, and it going untreated and affects their behaviors and their interactions and the relationships later on, with family members not really being able to understand or make connections as to the rationale behind these certain behaviors. We can also see that entire communities can be collectively traumatized. An example of this would be communities that have experienced a genocide. So a person themselves who is a member of this community does not necessarily have to have been personally victimized to feel that they are traumatized from the attacks on their people. And we can see a lot of different facets arise from this. For example, being hypersensitive about any perceived threats. We can see how the events are talked about becomes common throughout the community. We can see that people within this community learn certain things that are off limits to talk about or considered to be taboo, or too harmful to speak about, as well as, you know, communities often band together to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And that ties into the third point about historical trauma that forms identity and shapes identity. And I think a good example of that would be our Jewish community and their work around the remembrance of the Holocaust, and their ongoing commitment to public education and ensuring the safety of their people going forward. So to come back to our new COVID-19 world, Just a few more things on what this did to communities that were already working with trauma and vulnerability. We saw churches, religious festivals, community gatherings either have to shut down completely or go virtual. And as Leah's talked about before, we know what the difficulties of that has been. Ethnic restaurants, which not only provided a taste of home, but it was the memories, as well as the community, being able to use your language, being able to order, having that autonomy in these places. Many of them couldn't stay open. They couldn't afford to operate just a patio or operate takeout, and had to close them and lay off much of their staff. As well as any other ethno or language specific gathering or support group, just like here at CCVT, all of our support groups had to go online with mixed results, as well as political groups. Many of our youth were previously activists in their home countries, and they would stay engaged with forming groups here to stay connected with politics back home. So because of COVID, those gatherings aren't happening, as well as the virtual possibilities are really mixed depending on each individual situation. So this slide was developed by CCVT in our pre-COVID world. So if you can see at the top about structural barriers, racism was already an issue that newcomers were facing. Of course, there's also ongoing language barriers at all institutions and systems, and that includes French language. In the city of Toronto, it is hard to ensure that you get French language services everywhere you go. Poverty, again, was ongoing, as we know refugee claimants don't have the same access to resources that a convention refugee or permanent resident would have. We've talked about complex trauma histories, and then housing issues are huge for all of us in the settlement sector, whether that be underhousing, whether that be just issues with landlords, roommates, tenants, rental costs, the list goes on. Again, our communities are separated from their systems of support. And then assumptions about cultures and communities also ties in with xenophobic discourse on the following column. Not only do we see really pervasive stereotypes about particular cultural communities, but there's this dominant negative narrative about refugees in the media. They're queue jumpers, that they're liars, that they're scammers, whatever the case may be. So our clientele are up against these unspoken narratives at every turn. There's also ongoing concern for family back home. As well as the loneliness of exile. They're a stranger in a strange land. People don't know them, they don't know what they're capable of, they don't know who they are. And then of course, shifts in social locations. So a lot of people that we meet were often affluent or at least middle class back home. And coming here, not only is the trauma experiences as well as the issues with the migration journey and settlement, but it's finding themselves on social assistance and just having a complete turnaround from the life that they're used to. This also ties into what I talked about our political activists. When they get to Canada, they find that our politics is very apathetic. And so they often feel powerless when they compare the way that they were used to organizing and getting their concerns across. So just a few more notes on conceptualizing trauma. These could be really good talking points depending on the age and the knowledge level of the person that you're working with. For the younger group kids, we have it there as trauma is a wound or a soul wound. So making a comparison between an actual wound on your body and one in your spirit. Then there's also listing, explaining trauma is not necessarily outside of the range of usual human experience. It is not inconceivable that almost all of us on this Zoom meeting today at some point in our lives will experience a traumatic event. And so kind of having talks within that framework that, these things are horrible, but it is unfortunately a part of life. And then looking at trauma as a complex continuum. And the vast majority of people that I've worked with tell you that they want to forget their trauma, that it's happened, they want to put it in the past, and they just want to go forward with getting themselves better. And while it's commendable, it's not necessarily realistic. What we want to do is make sure that we understand that, trauma can still sneak up on us in all kinds of ways. And that looking at it as a sliding scale, that some days are going to be, not so great, and some days are going to get better. And we're going to continue to go along that spectrum. And then that ties in, of course, with trauma can be mitigated with support. With the development of interventions and coping mechanisms, we can work to live well with our trauma, but also be mindful that trauma can be exacerbated by other stressors going on, like the whole list of things that we've previously spoken about. So just a few more things to be mindful of, and I don't think anything on this slide is particularly profound or groundbreaking, but Leah and I wanted to include it because we thought there'd be some timely reminders based on what's going on in the media and the world around us. So just things to keep in mind when working from an anti-oppressive and an anti-racist approach. Refugee youth often face multiple interlocking forms of oppression during the entire migration process. So we know that refugee youth are a highly vulnerable population. But if we add other identities such as female identified or queer folk refugee youth, we know that we're most susceptible to assault, to violence, to sexual degradation, and that racialized women identified and queer folk refugee youth are even more at risk. And that when we're talking about oppression, we're not talking about just the obvious things of violence and exclusion. We also want to address things like inequality and social injustices. And then like anyone, refugee youth carry fluid identities that are very complex. They intersect with our culture, with their own culture, and it shapes how they access power, resources, safety, and personal agency. Like any one of us, we carry a multiple form of identities. We are not always oppressed in any given situation. We're not always privileged. So all the work that we're doing, there's no hard and fast rule. Everything is really situational and it's really contextual. And lastly, meaningful intervention must acknowledge social context and engage other levels of the youth experience. We don't work with our clients in a vacuum, just us alone in our offices, and that's it. We have to, address other things like the individual, the community level, institutions, systems, to ensure that we're providing or are working towards meaningful support. Just excuse me, please. So for us here, particularly in the city of Toronto, we feel that we can't talk about COVID accurately without talking about race and racialization and how they've intersected throughout the pandemic. So on CNN a few weeks ago, I heard a piece that COVID-19 had created the conditions that allowed for the protests to occur. And how they explained it was that in our previous pre-COVID world, we would hear about these escalating atrocities, not necessarily that they were escalating, but they were getting more media coverage. And there were always people on the ground doing the work. For the vast majority of us, we would be upset, we would be disgusted by what the imagery that we were seeing and the stories that we were hearing, and the injustices of everything. But we had so many other daily distractions. Like we still had work, school, childcare duties, volunteering, whatever the case may be. We were all leading very busy lives. And COVID-19 put the entire world at a standstill. People were out of work, there was no place to go, we were told to stay in our homes. And we were really heavily dependent on the media and social media. So when the unfortunate incident with Mr. George Floyd occurred back in May, I believe, the world was watching. And they were frustrated already from the number of other things that were happening, and they were upset and they needed somewhere to channel it. And that allowed for the flow of images, and that allowed for the flow of information. And we'd be able to understand about other atrocities that also occurred that had no other media coverage, like Breonna Taylor, like Ahmaud Arbery, like Elijah McCann the year before, and Shukri Abdi, a 12-year-old refugee child in the UK. Their murders have gone unpunished. So, I mean, these protests needed to happen, and it's amazing that they happen, and we've lived through history. But this had profound effects on our clientele. Many of our clients shared with Leah and myself that they were experiencing or really grappling with issues of racism for the first time in their lives. And a lot of our clients really understand other forms of discrimination, shadism, tribalism, religious discrimination, the list goes on. But to be, thinking about yourself in terms of racialized terms at this point was really, a shocking experience for a lot of people that we were talking to. There were a lot of concerns over personal safety, again, because of the police brutality they were seeing, as well as white supremacist groups that were, kind of pushing back. And many people mentioned what they saw with the Asian community across Canada. There were instances where the Asian community, the Chinese and Asian community, we're facing backlash because it was perceived that they brought COVID-19 to the world. So we were seeing the rise of assaults, both verbal and physical, on this community, and especially here in Toronto. This also exacerbated issues with authority figures. The majority of our clients had poor relationships or ideals about police and about people in authority. And a lot of our work that we're doing, especially with the younger folks, is kind of normalizing these relationships and seeing the police as more as community figures that are respectable. And that's really hard to do when people are looking at videos of the police murdering someone. There was also the expectations of coming to safety not being met, that Canada has this idea of just, a safe, reliable country that's very welcoming, and people get here and this is what they're seeing all around them, the protests, the brutality. At that time, I believe there was the Afro-Indigenous woman, Regis, I'm sorry, her last name escapes me at this point, but that had also gone on shortly after George Floyd, and that was also very frightening for a lot of our service users. There was, again, tied to that, the heightened sense of fear, uncertainty, and hopelessness, because we already didn't know what was happening because of COVID. We thought we'd be home 2 weeks. 5 months later, we're still, on Zoom and not being able to be together. So it really added to just not knowing what was going on around them. And then isolation, which is a common theme throughout the settlement experience as well as COVID, is just that there weren't people around. You couldn't bounce ideas. You couldn't talk out your fears and concerns just as easily, as readily as you could before. There was the constant barrage of social media imagery, and you were unable to find out the distractions because there was also the sense of feeling connected. If I'm not on some form of social media, I don't know what's going on with the world. And that made a lot of people, myself included, feel like I needed to stay on and need to see what was happening to keep up. And then, of course, back to the isolation piece, limited social circle support. My friends aren't there. My counselor is not available. I can't talk to my workmates the same way that I could. And people are also busy too, right? They have their own duties in the house that are kind of keeping them wrapped up. So particularly, we wanted to talk about the impacts in the city of Toronto, because we can't talk about COVID-19 here without speaking about how it has intersected with race, particularly as the majority of our clientele are racialized folk. So this is a map of the city. The top northern boundary is Steeles Avenue, and the bottom southern boundary is Lake Ontario. And I particularly want to talk about the 3 communities along the top with the darker shades of blue, with the blue representing the prevalence of COVID-19. So as we know, that COVID has taken on many different incarnations so far. At the beginning, it became something largely associated with China. It then became something that was more affluent because it was associated with travel, and a lot of celebrities were coming out and talking about their experiences with it and calling it the great equalizer. And we know that's erroneous, because it's in its present form, COVID-19 is largely targeting racialized populations. Of the 15,000 plus cases in the city of Toronto currently, 83% of them are Black and people of color. So I just want to give you more of a visual and explain this map a little bit to give it some context. These 3 neighborhoods along the top are largely well-established racialized communities. The one on the right is my neighborhood. It's Malvern Rouge River, and Elections Canada uses it as often for research purposes because they consider it to be one of the most racially diverse in Canada. The one, I guess, the left center, the far left center, that's where York University is, as well in Jane and Finch, the Jane and Finch community. And so there's a lot of students there, international and domestic, as well as people who are responsible for running the day-to-day operations of the university. And then on the far left, my far left, that's going to be Rexdale, Islington, Panorama Court, etc. So not only were they well-established communities, they had a plethora of, community organizations and spaces, community centers, churches, mosques, temples, as well as ethnic restaurants, cultural stores, grocery stores. But they also had the, maybe not availability, but the diverse options for housing, such as shelter spaces, community spaces, as well as a lot of landlords being more willing to accept social assistance. And rents are definitely cheaper than the downtown core, which would be at the very bottom on the lake in the center. So that made these neighborhoods, more desirable to newcomers and refugee populations. What we know largely is that racialized people have been on the forefront of the pandemic, being involved in food production, in the production of other materials, and in healthcare. We're seeing here at CCBC that many of our female clients have been PSWs on the front line working in COVID care. And for these particular people, we're also seeing issues of them living in spaces where they couldn't quarantine if they had symptoms. They couldn't take 14 days off work, and they couldn't go anywhere. They just didn't have the means to do that. And they're living with big families as well as multi-generation, so that, older folks in their household may be more susceptible. So that was just to give some context on how this has particularly taken on a racialized nature here in Toronto. Next slide, please. So we want to start going towards, what we can do to do some reframing in our work with this particular population, both within COVID and without. And so instead of just continuing to talk about the problem, how can we reframe this to talk about resiliency and strengths-based? How do we illustrate that and what makes us stronger? And really it's looking at any potential strengths that our clientele exhibits. This could be survival, it could be something that illustrates their resourcefulness, even their enhanced understanding for people who are oppressed or for social justice causes. How do we reimagine these issues? How do we put a realism to them? And how can this foster preservation and closer communities? So just some touchstones for working with child and youth population, this particular child and youth populations. And I'm not going to go through all of them, there are a lot, but just some ones that I feel are important to talk about. Acknowledge power dynamics. Immediately as a worker, when someone steps into your office, there is a power imbalance. There is nothing we can do about that from the get-go, right? You are the worker and the service user believes that you are the key to making things better. Have conversations around that, address that. How can you incorporate your service user into care? What agency could they have in these dynamics? You know, even just talking about it and making sure it's open and on the table would be helpful from the get-go. Practice ongoing critical self-reflection. During rehearsal yesterday, I was sharing with my colleagues that quite a few parents approached me during the initial issues with the protests, and they wanted to know about how to have conversations with their kids about racism. And I really had to think within myself that I was unequipped to do that. Even though I'm a racialized person, my own experiences with racism happened largely as long as I can remember, maybe as young as kindergarten. So it was a concept that I feel like I always grew with and that I knew of. And that was largely the same for my family and my social circle. So I felt totally unprepared to break it to someone else about, you know, the injustices of racism. And I really had to start looking and doing some reflective work within myself to see how I could be a better resources for my clients, because I feel like that was a place that really I wasn't prepared to start having those conversations yet. Contextualize trauma within a socio-political context. I think sometimes it's helpful, especially in situations of war, where we can kind of show the big picture and talk about a lot of players and things not just being personal, if that you think that would be helpful. Avoid potential triggers. This is a big piece for us here at CCVT because we have to be mindful of triggers, and trigger can be any sight, sound, smell that causes a psychological or physiological response connected to a previous negative event. Triggers in kids, it could be all kinds of things. I know Halloween decorations is a big one, such as pumpkins or skeletons, Remembrance Day ceremonies because of the soldiers and guns. It could be keys. You never keys because some people are reminded of their jailers. A lot of people who've been in detention are very triggered by small windowless rooms. But the thing with this is that people often don't know what their own triggers are, and you yourself might not know, but just be mindful of some things that might seem a little bit more obvious. And challenge dehumanizing trauma narratives, details over resistance over violence, which we've spoken about previously. Leah, if we could go to the next slide, please. So resist paternalistic, condescending language and attitude. And I would also like to add to that, you know, use very simple language, avoid jargon, acronyms. In the social services, we don't have time to say anything, so we make short forms. Slang, I'm very guilty of that. Slang is often very contextual too and dependent on your social location. And people are polite. They might not necessarily ask you to clarify. So just to keep the lines of communication open, just be very mindful of the language that you're using. Facilitate access to appropriate interpretation whenever possible. I know my boss is listening, but interpretation is not my favorite thing. I would prefer to offer someone language, first language services, then get an interpreter. If that is not possible though, try to avoid having family members interpret for each other, kids interpret for their parents and vice versa. And if that also is not possible, then make your communication very short until it is possible to do so. Avoid asking questions that don't serve the person. I had a little boy in my after school program who was from Eritrea, and he was just learning English. And one day he finished his work really, really early and he just wanted to play. And I tried to engage him in a conversation where we kind of talked about your emergency information. You know, what do you do if there's an emergency? Who do you call? Where do you live? And to keep him engaged, I started to make these questions more rapid fire. So he would answer me quickly and he would think about it. And it started off okay at first, but as this went on, he started to shut down on me. He wouldn't look at me. He put his head down. He stopped talking. And the only thing he said was, Nadia, why are you talking to me like you're the police? And shortly afterwards, I learned that he witnessed a police interrogation of his mother prior to her detention. So that's made me really mindful of the reason why I do things or the questions that I'm going to ask going forward. A lot of our clientele doesn't really understand what all of this information is being asked for and what's going to happen. They believe it might, you know, affect their permanent record somewhere. So it's very important to be open and transparent about, you know, our lines of questionings and why we're doing certain things. Avoid pathologizing discourse. It makes a big difference on how we say things. So instead of someone being a traumatized person, they could be a person who's experienced trauma. Instead of being bipolar, I'm a person who lives with bipolar disorder. Instead of victim, survivor. You know, the list goes on. Just being more mindful of our word choices. And empower, acknowledge strengths, resiliency, facilitate opportunities for leadership, which is really important. Going back to ensuring agency, and letting people know that they're really an active participant in their recovery. So I think Leah is going to take over next.
Thank you. Okay. So this is the last slide here. So we had created a tip sheet to supporting survivor children and youth during COVID-19, and it is actually accessible on our website, so csvt.org, I believe it is, or is it .ca? I think it's .org, but we can check for you. But it is a tip sheet and it's very thorough. So it has these titles and some descriptions as well. So these are just some of the kind of the main takeaways supporting children and youth survivors during COVID-19. So I mean, fostering hope, scheduling family time, taking breaks, try to get outside as much as possible, and just reiterate that we're all in this together. So that leads us into our case study. So I'm going to post in the chat the case study, and then we're going to do some breakout rooms. So just to check in on time, it's 11 o'clock. We hope to be done the whole presentation at 11:30. So we're going to take 15 minutes to do the case study, and then we'll have a 15-minute Q&A. I did see there was some questions popping up in the chat, so we'll address that in a bit. So we're going to do breakout rooms. How many people are there? 43. And I'm also going to post the case study in the chat. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. Okay.
Okay, and just to step in, Leah, so 15 minutes, so which means the small groups will have approximately about 10 minutes, let's say 8 to 10 minutes to discuss, and then they'll come back to the larger group for another 5 minutes to kind of share their thoughts. Would that be ideal?
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay.
Okay, so sorry, I'm just posting it in the chat here. Case study. Okay, does everyone see that there? The file? No? Oh, people do. So some people see it, but some don't?
Can you copy and paste it, Leah?
Yeah, I can. I see it. People are saying they see it.
The file is uploaded, it's there, but also maybe another option would be just to copy paste the case study in the chat box. Okay. So people have various options. So those who are not able to download it, you can just look at your chat. In the chat box, the question and the case study will be there.
Yeah, it's not letting me paste it for some reason. Maybe it's too long. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But I would assume that once we do breakout rooms, at least one person is going to have access to the case study. So maybe they can just share it with everyone, okay? So I think we're going to divide everyone up into, let's try 6 groups here. Okay, so we're going to have 10 minutes to discuss within your group, and then we're going to call you back to the main screen, okay? So how many rooms did I say? Let's do 7, yeah, 5 to 6. Okay, okay, bye everyone. We'll visit you to make sure everything is going well, okay? Was everyone able to get into a breakout room? I think there's some people that were missed. Oh, I think Nadia went to a room. Okay, so just keeping track of the time, 11:05.
By maybe 11:10.
So 5 minutes?
11:15, is that, or?
Yeah, 11:15. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
For the other participants, oh, okay, they're going slowly, I think, into the rooms. Okay, Mabelo, I'm just actually going to join a room, make sure that everything is going well. Actually,
Stay here in case someone else comes back.
yeah. I sent them all a message. Do you need any support? Some of these questions are challenging. Excuse me. think I'm just going to give it one more minute, and then I'll close the rooms, and then it gives them a minute notice in the room. Welcome back, Domine. Okay, did everyone get a chance to discuss it? Thumbs up?
Yeah, kind of, yeah. For
kind
the most
of?
part. Yeah,
okay,
okay.
okay.
Yeah.
I know, it's a lot. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I know we didn't have too much time, but I hope we can share some of what was talked about. We'll just wait a little bit until everyone gets back. Is everyone back? I think we're good. All right. So I just have it up here on the screen again. I would like to just have kind of a conversation and discuss some of these reflection questions. So the first question is kind of above the reflection question, but in doing an assessment of the client's needs, what information might be helpful to explore with her? Consider her multiple identities and roles and the impacts that COVID-19 has had. You can feel free to type it in the chat or, you know, click.
I think one of the important thing is to connect her with housing information. Housing,
yeah.
because she has a problem now, and
yeah, and that might be difficult during COVID-19.
I know, yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, maybe connecting with a housing worker. Yeah.
In our group, we talked about primary care. It seems to me like she's really feeling very down. She could be depressed. So it would be useful to connect her with a family doctor. So maybe they could do depression screening and see where she's at in terms of her moods and.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So primary care. And it asks what information might be helpful to explore with her. So, yeah.
For now, like it sounds that priority needs to be met at the beginning. So it sounds that basic needs such as shelter, financial support, and medical support are the priority that needs to be addressed or discussed. So further details about how to address these needs might be the start of the conversation. Creating a safety plan with a client to ensure that these basic needs has or will be met in a timely manner. So I believe this is a starting point. It sounds that she has a legal an access to some legal support. She does have a lawyer who is helping her with her narrative. So I assume with her refugee case. So other basic needs, as I said earlier, like housing, financial support, and medical support, as long as community support or social support, because it sounds that she has been cut off or her social network, and she does not have really strong network to support her at that current moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think we have a question or a chat. In our team, we talked about asking about education, professional goals, and asking if she's connected or interested in connecting with the LGBTQ plus community. Yeah. So I think like what Samar was saying, kind of there's that criteria, the first and foremost things that need to be followed up with, and then definitely connecting her, which is just as important in some cases, being able to connect them to community resources and their community is extremely important. So thanks, Gabriella. If we look at, we kind of covered that first reflection question, but the second one, so what socio-political and structural challenges come to mind when considering her situation? Did people get to discuss this one?
It was a tough reflection questions. Yeah. What I'm thinking is with the social political structure challenge is where she sees herself in the society and what it means like to be a lesbian for her here in Canada and what the experience was in Uganda, and finding that status or that place in the society and feel safe and live safe and access resources, and all that is what I'm thinking. And also the structure challenges are what's kind of operation are here in Canada that impact her opportunities to access resources, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Just a comment, Leah, that actually has a lot to say about, our society, because an asylum claim wasn't considered an essential service. So whereas lottery in the LCBO was, a right to asylum was considered, good enough to be postponed until a later date, which is just something to consider when we're thinking about the wider context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks, Rahel and Nadia. So, yeah, it's 11:20. So we'll quickly, how might you explore resistance with this client? And we kind of already talked about that, that last one. So just, we'll talk about this one real quick and then we'll get into the Q&A. So how might you explore resistance with this client? I think Gabby kind of touched upon it, playing on the service user's strengths. What is her goal? What is she hoping to achieve? But then also, kind of touching upon that she left Uganda. She left. Sorry, was it a violent? Yeah, violence at the hands of her family. She left a violent situation. So just talking about, the strength and the resistance that the service user experienced as well. Nadia, I don't know if you want to add anything. Is that good?
No, that was great. Thanks.
Is there anyone else that wants to add to that point before we move on?
I think it's also just important to let the trust between you and the young person develop naturally. Yeah. There's an acknowledgement that we do have some power, and there's a tremendous fear in our experience here at Covenant House that young people really feel very afraid that we're going to report to immigration some sort of information that would impact their claim. And so letting the relationship build naturally, acknowledging the grief and the trauma, these things take time. So leaving it very client-led, I think, is essential.
Yeah, that's a great point, Maria. Thank you. Okay. So that actually brings us to the end of our presentation. So thank you, everyone. I know that's a lot of information, but we appreciate everyone coming together today. So we will have a question and answer period. So I'm actually going to stop sharing so that we can see everyone's faces. Okay. So was there any specific questions? I know we had some questions come up in the chat.
I have gathered some, Leah.
Okay.
Okay.
So precursor, we will try our best to answer these questions, me and Nadia. And if anyone at any time has, answers or wants to chime in, please do so.
Okay, so Leah, Nadia, sorry. What is the youngest age of unaccompanied child / youth you have seen on your caseload?
For me, it hasn't been that young. I think 16. What happens unless the child doesn't have family and they arrive at Pearson Airport, which is outside of Toronto city limits, and there's no one there that's going to claim them, the Children's Aid Society of Peel Region gets involved. And they take over the case management. So where I am on the other side, way east, I haven't worked with CAS in that capacity as yet. So the ones I have would be youth who've had other supports available to them.
Yeah.
Yuli?
Yeah, it's the same as you, I guess. 16, and it was with CAS that I was supporting that service user, and usually the younger children are here with their families. So I personally, out of my experience, and I think it has to do with what Nadia was saying, downtown, that the children are usually here with someone or a sibling, an older sibling. I don't know if anyone's experiences are different.
Yeah, so I work with Peel Children's Aid on the immigration team.
Nice.
Yeah, hi. And you're correct, Nadia. So unless a child has a family member or someone they're coming to, then we do get involved. So we're called by CBSA to attend the airport. And if the child has no grown-up or caregiver to take them on, then they do come into our care. And then we start to reach out to different services within the community to see how we can help those children. But unless they're living in Toronto, if we know that there's a caregiver in Toronto, we still are called, but then we hand them over to the caregiver because they're entering into our jurisdiction. So we do that assessment to make sure the caregiver is a safe place for the child, and do the parents know that this child is coming into care with this person. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. We are the first contact with any minor that comes in, and they can be as young as 14.
Okay. Thank you. That's great. That's great that you're joining us today and can share that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Gabby, next question.
Another question. How long does it take for minors to get a decision on their case from the date of claim?
So, Nadia, I'll just talk about one point here, but I know that there's working with the child and youth psychiatrist at CCVT, there are reports that she does, which is a best interest of the child report. So sorry, the question was, how long does it take?
Yes, from the date of claim to get a decision on their case. Is it the same then with adults, or?
To be honest, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that the best interest of the child is taken into consideration, and I'm not sure how that impacts the timeline. Nadia, I'm not sure if you know directly.
Nadia, you're muted.
Nadia, you're muted.
Sorry, everyone. I haven't seen cases where it's been protracted in many of the cases with the adults, but I don't believe there's a standardized time frame for expedition in those particular cases.
So I'll chime in again.
Thank you.
And just speaking from experience, there isn't a timeline, but however, for the minors, we do advocate with CBSA or RIB to have their cases heard sooner. And in most cases they are, because they're here as a minor. So they looked at differently from the adult cases that are here. Right, so I won't say it takes up to 3 months or 6 months, but it is a quicker process for the children, especially those who are in care, and because of the fact that they are a minor. And so that's the difference that I can provide with adult applications.
Great, thank you so much.
It's interesting because in my case, I have seen families but not unaccompanied minors, like they are minors with families. Sometimes parents get accepted and the minors are not, due to their nationality or citizenship or belonging to other having citizenship from other state country or whatsoever. So families might be struggling with having adults accepted or got their status while still struggling with getting status for the children.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like awkward in some cases that these children become adults, like they hit the age of 18 while they are still not, their case has not been approved yet, and they have to go through another process in process. So it's kind of like a bit different if accompanied by an adult.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about that like at CCVT. I think Rahel H had a case too, or Kubra, one of our colleagues, but
yeah, I do have some, as well.
Yeah, even yourself. I personally haven't come across it yet, but probably because, I'm working with unaccompanied youth mostly. So maybe that's why, but I don't really have specific experience about those cases. I don't know, Nadia, if you do.
The same for me, for many of the reasons that Samar has already mentioned, and also because in the notices of decision, they've basically deemed that the child would not be persecuted in the same way that the adult would be, despite them not having agency on their own. So I've had a few of the cases, but not many.
Okay. Thank you. Gabby?
Yeah, we have like 1, 2, 3, 4 more. I don't know if you want to take a few and maybe answer some via email after.
Yeah, we can do that. I know we have 1 minute left.
Yeah.
We can try to work on this next one, and then we can email whoever it may be.
Okay, so what do you think should be priorities for trauma-informed care for child well-being going forward?
That's a good question. So just quickly, I think triggers is a huge one that comes to my mind. And I know Nadia had touched upon it, but just how simple, you think you're playing a game with a kid, and then it's triggering all of those feelings and the past and the trauma. So I think just being super aware. And when I first started this position, this was the number one thing, was just being always aware of what I was saying and the implications and how it was going to affect the child and youth that I was supporting. So that's a huge one for me. Nadia?
To add to that, I think safety is a big piece for me. So I kind of always start with the safety scan. What is the physical, the mental well-being, the health safety that's going on in the situation? Is there suicidal ideation? Is there...
Oh no. You froze, Nadia.
Wellness that we should be, as well as, having a look at the caregiver.
Nadia, I don't know if you can hear me, but it's frozen and glitchy.
Oh, did you hear anything?
No.
Okay, don't worry about it then.
No,
sorry about that.
It's good. So suicidal an assessment, risk assessment.
So what I was trying to say is safety is normally my first piece. I look at physical and mental well-being and any other, if suicide is the possibility, also the fitness of a caregiver.
Right. Yeah, that's important as well, for sure. Also, we have that tip sheet. So whoever had asked that question, please go to our website. I know Gabriella had posted it on the side there. Was it .org, Gabby? CCVT.org?
Yes, it's .org.
Okay, perfect. So please check it out. It is a tip sheet to working and supporting survivor children and youth. So just go straight to the website and you'll see it, and it navigates a lot of that as well. And hopefully the touchstones that Nadia had talked about at the end of the presentation, which we'll share with you. We're going to send everyone the presentation as well. Hopefully you can use those as reminders, things to check in with. I hope that answered that person's question. Okay, well, it's 11:32. I guess we will wrap up, but thank you everyone. If your question wasn't answered, we can email you if we have the name written down. So we really appreciate everyone taking the time to come out today. We hope that you were able to take something away from it. And we really appreciate, thank you, Mandisa, for sharing your experiences as well. That was really insightful. So
thank you for having us. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you for attending, everyone. Take care.
And there's going to be 2 more sessions that we have left that's coming up next in the next 2 weeks. So please, if you haven't joined or registered, please do register. And again, we would like to thank Leah and Nadia for taking your time to share your work experience during COVID-19. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us as well. And hopefully this has been a great learning experience for you as well. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Sorry, I just saw Val had posted in the chat. Oh, is that Val?
Oh yeah, I have the question from Val.
Oh, good. So we'll send you an email, Val, and hopefully we can address the question that was answered.
Okay, so it's 11:33. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone, take care.
Thank you.